Get ready for a terrifying and immersive journey into the heart of a cursed orphanage, where evil doesn't just hide in the shadows, but seeps into the very walls. This is a place where lost souls still wander, waiting for innocent victims. What happened in that orphanage? What do the children who once lived there still whisper on stormy nights? The answers, however, are buried in the ruins, where every crack and every sigh seems to carry sinister secrets. Watch until the end. Pay close attention to every detail, because what you're about to discover will make you question what's real and what's just an illusion. Don't forget to leave a like if you're ready to face the unknown and follow this chilling story until the very last second. After all, would you be able to escape this place if it were you?
The wind fiercely, carrying the echoes of that seemed to herald the orphan and old, and its worn walls hold no one dared to reveal, and the shadows of the windows appeared to the moonlight. Inside, the silence was thick, interrupted only by the of the wooden board bent on. In the dark corridors, where the air was heavy and damp, the sound of muffled footsteps echoed as if something or someone was watching. Each room seemed enveloped in a fog of mystery, as if the building itself were breathing, exhaling the memory of untold stories. The few who still resided in the orphanage, orphans of a childhood stolen by loneliness and abandonment, felt a strange and unsettling presence, as if the place itself were alive. However, they all remained silent, not out of fear, but from an unspoken wisdom that some things are better left unasked. And as the wind continued to howl, striking the walls of the orphanage with renewed force, something else seemed to move in the shadow, something that waited for the right moment to reveal. Since the new residents had arrived, something strange had started. The children, usually cheerful and noisy, were quieter. Their vacant stares, sometimes fixed on invisible points, made the few staff members wonder what could be affecting those small hearts. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter and play, had now become unsettling and heavy, as if something had invaded the place unseen, but was felt with every passing moment. The change began subtly, almost imperceptible. At first, there were just longer silences during daily activity, but over time, the children's gazes became increasingly distant, as if they were looking at something beyond the reality surrounding them. Some spoke in whispers, others refused to speak, as though there was an invisible weight that silenced them. The staff tried everything. More games, more attention, but nothing seemed to break the fog of apathy that enveloped the children. And then they began to notice that when they approached, the children would stop staring into the void and look directly at them with an empty gaze, yet at the same time filled with something indescribable. One night in the orphanage, one of the caregivers heard a whisper in the rooms. He entered, and a group of children sitting motionless. They didn't react, nor did they move when he approached. They just remained there, their eyes fixed once again on something he couldn't see. And it was in that moment that true fear began to take hold of the adults. Something was deeply wrong, and whatever it was growing within the walls of the orphanage, something that the children, in some way, seemed to understand better than they did. One night, little Mariana, one of the youngest at the orphanage, began talking about an invisible friend. She spoke of him with a sweetness that seemed sincere, but her eyes showed a restlessness that made her tremble. The said friend, she said, wanted to take her away, to where she couldn't say. The girl's words were soft but carried a tone of distress, as if, by mentioning him, something hidden and undesirable was drawing near. He says he's waiting for me outside in the forest where no one can find me, in a low and trembling voice, as she looked at the corners as though the friend was watching everything from an invisible. The other children around her listened attentively, but some began to move away, visibly uncomfortable. They didn't know what to, but fear was starting to sprout in the depths of their eyes. The staff tried gently to change the subject, saying that the invisible friend didn't exist, that it was just an imagination game. However, Mariana's expression didn't change, and she seemed even more tense, as if trying to understand something trapped. In the following night, Mariana's whispers about the friend became more frequent. She called him by name, always the kindness that contrast with the growing anguish. He doesn't want me to live, insists. He's getting impatient. He says he doesn't have time anymore. And with a deep sigh, she concluded he doesn't like to wait. The other children, who had previously ignored the conversation, now felt the presence of the invisible friend in little Mariana's words. Something was taking shape between the lines, something that couldn't be explained but seemed real enough for the more sensitive. The feeling that the girl was being called to an unknown fate began to haunt the orphanage. At night, the wind blew strongly outside. The lights flickered on the old walls of the building, as if they were about to go out. Mariana's restlessness grew with each passing minute. She looked one last time at the others with a fragile smile and whispered, "He'll come to get me soon, and when that happens, calling my name won't help." The darkness then seemed to envelop everything more forcefully, as if preparing for something only she. The other children, for the most part, ignored Mariana. They laughed, played, and ran around the yard, paying no attention to the little one who was increasingly isolating her from the group. However, Clara, an older, observant girl, noticed something strange. It was a faint and distant light, almost ethereal, as if Mariana were looking at something that wasn't there. For a brief moment, Clara had the unsettling feeling that the girl didn't see her, but rather something beyond her, and somehow she herself was also being watched. That light in Mariana's eyes was not ordinary. It didn't have the liveliness of a child, nor the curious sparkle that normally filled children's gazes. It was as if it were a reflection of something far away, a faint flame that flickered on and off the depth. A cold premonition spread through Clara. She felt a strange urge to pull away, but something compelled her to approach. When she got closer to silence, the little girl didn't. She just sitting in the corner of her hands and slightly tilted. It was as if her presence in that physical was merely an empty shell, while her mind spirit was somewhere. Clara softly called Mariana's name, but the girl didn't move. She just kept staring into the distant, unfocused, as if in a trance. "Mariana," Clara insisted, but the girl didn't even blink. Clara crouched beside her, watching her eyes more close. Something was deeply wrong. The girl seemed to be in another world, and Clara could feel it viscerally. The sensation that something invisible was pulling her away became almost palpable, and the unease that had once hovered over her turned into a presence, a shadow that stretched and enveloped her. "Who's there with you?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if fearing to invoke something that shouldn't. Mariana then slowly turned her, awakening. Her eyes met Clara's for a brief moment, but there was no recognition in them. It was as if, in that glance, Clara was no longer a friend or a companion, but merely a fleeting figure in a world where nothing seemed to make sense. "He's here," Mariana murmured with a sad, almost imperceptible. "He says I can't go back." Clara was feeling the weight of fear. Something was happening to Mariana, something she couldn't understand, but somehow knew was very real. The wind howled again, and for a moment Clara thought a whisper in the background, as if the orphanage itself were breathing, waiting for something that couldn't be avoided. One night, Clara decided to follow Mariana to the basement, where the girl often was alone. The other children avoided the place, saying there was something strange about the damp, but Clara, driven by growing curiosity and the need to understand what was happening to Mariana, could no longer ignore the signs. She knew that somehow the little one was being called to that place, and Clara felt she needed to discover. The smell of mold and damp filled. With each step, the atmosphere grew denser and an uncomfortable over her body. The dim light of a lamp hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting distorted shadows on the exposed brick walls. The air was heavy and cold, as if the basement itself were a forgotten place, a space where time and life had no access. When Clara finally reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes adjusted to the gloom. The basement was empty, except for an old rocking chair, which moved slowly. The sound of the rocking, soft and rhythmic, echoed through the room like a distant whisper. Clara stopped, her heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. The chair seemed to move on its own, as if someone were pushing it, but no one was in sight. The girl, who had walked a few steps ahead, was now standing still, watching the chair with a distant and absorbed expression. "Mariana?" Clara called, her voice trembling but determined. The little girl didn't react, her eyes fixed on the chair as though she were waiting for something or someone. Clara felt a chill run up her spine. She took a step forward, the sound of her shoes on the concrete breaking the heavy silence. Mariana then slowly turned her head, her eyes empty and lifeless, as if she didn't recognize. "He's waiting for me here," the girl whispered, her voice soft and drawn out, as if she were talking about something distant, far beyond the basement of the orphanage. "He says the chair is the place I can go, where he will take me." Clara felt an icy shiver take over her body. She looked again at the chair, its movement almost imperceptible, but constant. Something about that scene was wrong, very wrong. A sudden terror flooded her, as if the very place were alive, and something that Mariana saw and felt was already in control of her, pulling her away from reality. "Mariana, we need to leave here. Let's go back upstairs now," Clara said, trying to stay calm. She took a step toward the girl, but something stopped her. The girl, with a strange and sad smile, looked at her and whispered, "I'm not from here anymore, Clara. The friend won't let me come back." The rocking chair moved faster now, as if it were impatient. The air grew heavier, denser, and Clara had the sensation that the basement was closing in on her. She tried to pull Mariana, but the girl seemed frozen in place, her body light, almost ethereal. Clara's eyes widened as she realized that it wasn't just the chair moving anymore. Something, or someone, was beginning to take shape in the darkness. The tension in the air was palpable. Time seemed to freeze, and Clara, with her heart pounding, realized that something very old and dark was waiting to reveal itself. And perhaps the only thing she could do was leave that Mariana standing still, staring at her face, once angelic, was contorted in an expression of fear, her wide eyes as if seeing something Clara couldn't comprehend. The girl trembled slightly. She didn't move. The chair, rocking gently in a monotonous rhythm, seemed to be waiting. The darkness around them seemed to grow, swallowing every corner of the basement, as if the very environment was becoming part of what was happening there. Clara, her heart pounding in her chest, tried to call her name. "Mariana." Her voice, usually firm, came out hoarse and fragile, and strangely, it seemed to disappear as soon as it touched the air. The sound was swallowed by the dense darkness that dominated, as if the darkness itself had the power to silence any attempt at communication. Clara took a step forward, her body feeling heavy, as if it were being pressed by an invisible. "Mariana, look at me. You need to leave here," Clara insisted, her voice growing more desperate. But the little girl didn't move, her eyes still fixed on the chair, as if she were in a trance. It was as if her mind were already elsewhere, being called by something that enveloped her, making her distant from everything and everyone. The air felt denser, colder, and Clara had the sensation that something was watching every move she made. She took another step, trying to reach Mariana, but something stopped her. A shadow, indistinct and fluid, stretched across the walls, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. Clara felt a deep shiver run down her spine. Something was approaching. She didn't know what to do. The feeling of helplessness and fear overwhelmed her, but she couldn't leave Mariana alone, trapped by something she didn't understand. Clara moved closer, but when she tried to touch Mariana's arm, she felt the girl's skin cold, as if it were not human, as if it were an empty shell. Clara's touch made Mariana finally move, but not to look at Clara. Her eyes were still fixed on the chair, and she murmured in a trembling, distant voice, "He says I am the chosen one. He will take me. There's no going back." The chair rocked faster, and Clara felt a growing panic. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and a low, vibrating sound began to seep into the basement, a distant melody, almost inaudible, but causing a feeling of tightness in her chest. Mariana took a step toward the chair, and Clara, desperate, tried to grab her. "No, Mariana, don't go there!" The words seemed to be absorbed but without echo, as if swallowed by the darkness, but the girl didn't hear. Her steps were slow and hesitant, as if she were being guided by a force she couldn't understand. Clara felt desperation flood her body. Something was happening to Mariana, something beyond any explanation, something that was pulling her into a dark fate she couldn't control. The chair rocked faster and faster, until, with one last sigh of the cold wind, it stopped, and in the next instant the basement fell into complete silence. Suddenly, the chair stopped rocking. The sound of its movement ceased abruptly, and a dense silence filled the basement. But then, something moved in the shadows, a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, as if the darkness itself were alive and writhing. Clara, her heart racing, felt the panic grow inside her chest. Her body trembled, and her quick, shallow breaths seemed to be the only thing she could hear. She looked at Mariana, desperately hoping that the girl was still there, that maybe it was all just a nightmare. But what she found made her freeze. Mariana was no longer there. The place where she had stood moments before was empty, the traces of her presence vanishing into the darkness as if erased by an invisible hand. Clara looked around, her eyes darting from one corner to another, searching for any sign of the girl. But in her place, only the echo of silence seemed to respond, like a suffocating presence surrounding her. Panic took over Clara with the force of a blow. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, as if the very air was becoming denser, thicker. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and the shadows on the walls began to move in an unsettling way, as if they were forms, more than just shadows. Clara took a step back, but the floor seemed to give way beneath her feet, as if the basement were morphing into something she couldn't comprehend. "Mariana," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow, as if there was no one to hear them. The sound of her voice was swallowed by the silence, absorbed by a force she couldn't see but felt, growing stronger with each second. She looked again at where the girl had been, fear tightening her chest, but there was nothing but the shadows that stretched and writhed, creating strange and threatening shapes on the stone wall. Time seemed to... The air was frozen, dense and heavy. The feeling that something was watching her, something ancient and terrible, intensified, and Clara had the impression that the very basement was breathing with her, sensing her panic, waiting for something, perhaps her surrender. She swallowed hard, trying to move, but her legs felt like they were trapped, heavy and unresponsive. And then, something at the far end of the basement moved again, faster now, closer. Clara didn't know if it was her mind playing tricks on her, or if something truly was there. But before she could react, the shadows overtook her, and what had once been an old, forgotten basement transformed into something much deeper, much darker, something that had already claimed Mariana and was now extending its claws, seeking more. Panic was the last thing Clara felt before the silence enveloped her completely. In the following days, Clara felt increasingly strange, as if something was constantly watching her. It was an unsettling, vague sensation that settled in her chest and refused to leave. Wherever she went, felt the weight of invisible eyes, as if a presence was always nearby, lurking in the shadows. She tried to ignore it, but every step she took seemed heavier. The walls of the orphanage, once so familiar, now disturbed her, and even the whispers of the other children seemed muffled or distant. She spent her days avoiding looking out the windows, the shadows of the night to take on a life of their own. Every time the light of day began to fade, Clara felt a growing tension, a sense that something or someone was waiting on the other side of the glass. When she looked out the window, the shadows stretched unnatural, writhing and transforming into shapes that didn't align with reality. It was as if something within the darkness was simply waiting for total darkness. It was as if the orphanage had become a place time didn't, and reality distorted. During the day, the hours seemed to drag slowly, as if the very clock had been manipulated, and at night, the minutes compressed, leaving Clara with the feeling that time had stopped, or worse, was bending in the wrong way. The lights flickered on the walls, and the sound of the wind in the trees outside seemed almost muffled, as if the air itself was thick and heavy. Even the children were different. Some, quieter, seemed immersed in distant thoughts, while others no longer spoke, as if they had lost the ability to react to the world around them. The orphanage, once a place of confusion and noise, now felt like a place trapped, lifeless, where the walls held secrets, and the echo of footsteps seemed to carry an unbearable weight. Clara tried to understand what was happening, but with each passing day, it became harder to distinguish reality from what was being suggested by the shadows. Deep down, she knew something was wrong, something that had started with Mariana and was now spreading, enveloping everyone around her. But what exactly it was, she couldn't comprehend. She couldn't understand. The only thing Clara knew for certain was that somehow she was not alone there, and not just because of the other children, but because of something deeper, something that watched her patiently, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. One morning, Mrs. Anna, the caretaker of the orphanage, began to notice Clara's strange behavior. The young girl, normally so serious and responsible, seemed paler than ever. Her eyes, once bright and alert, were now deep-set, with dark circles that made her gaze vacant and distant. There was a permanent expression of terror on her face, an anguish she couldn't hide, as if she were trapped in an eternal state of apprehension. Mrs. Anna, concerned, watched Clara during breakfast. The young girl barely touched her food, and instead of talking to the other children as usual, she remained silent, staring at some point, as if listening to something that no one else could hear. Mrs. Anna knew something was wrong. Clara had always been introspective, but never like this, never. Noticing the increasingly unusual behavior of the young girl, Mrs. Anna approached her cautiously. She tried to get her attention, but Clara didn't respond immediately. The woman lightly touched her shoulder, and the girl finally turned her head, but she didn't seem to really see her. Her eyes were empty, as if looking through Anna, as if she were just another shadow in a distant, unrecognizable. "Clara, my dear, what happened? You're not feeling well." Mrs. Anna's voice was soft, full of concern, but Clara just took a deep breath, as if trying to push away a horrible sensation consumed her. I saw," Clara murmured, her words coming out disconnected, without sequence, as if she were trying to piece together something she couldn't. "He is everywhere. The shadows. They... Mrs. Anna furrowed her brow, trying to understand what Clara was trying to say, but she couldn't. The young girl's words were incomplete, tangled in a whirlwind of confusion, as if she were caught between reality and something else, something that left her paralyzed with fear. "Clara, darling, you need to rest. Come with me. We'll talk more about this, all right?" Mrs. Anna tried to get closer, but Clara took a step back, her eyes now glazed over, as if Anna's presence was pulling her away from a terrifying truth. "He's coming," Clara whispered low and trembling. "I saw. He's watching. I can't escape." Mrs. Anna chilled. The young girl had never spoken like this before, and the fear in her eyes made her realize that whatever was happening, it wasn't simple. Something was invading the orphanage, and she didn't know what to do to stop it. Clara, now completely immersed in her own thought, no longer seemed to notice Mrs. Anna. Her eyes were fixed on something no one else could see, and her breathing was irregular, as if she were desperately trying to free herself from an invisible, overwhelming presence. Mrs. Anna slowly stepped back, her heart heavy with what she had just witnessed. She knew that Clara wasn't just going through an emotional or psychological crisis. Something much more sinister was at play, and the orphanage, the place that had always been a refuge, now seemed to be the epicenter of a mystery that even she couldn't understand. "They are coming," Clara whispered, her voice weak and trembling, before collapsing into Mrs. Anna's arms. "They want to take me too. They already took Mariana." The fear in her voice was palpable, a deep anguish that made Mrs. Anna's heart tighten in her chest. Clara's body, now limp, made her bend down, trying to support the young girl, but her mind was far from just worrying about Clara's health. Something much more serious was happening, something that Clara's disjointed words and the terror on her face could no longer hide. Mrs. Anna took a deep breath, trying to push away the panic that was beginning to spread within her too. But what Clara had said about them and what happened to Mariana could not be ignored. Mariana had disappeared under strange circumstances, and no one in the orphanage seemed to have any answer. Now Clara was talking about an invisible presence, something that was coming, something that wanted to take the children. And she was convinced it had already taken Mariana. With Clara still unconscious in her arms, Mrs. Anna wasted no time. She carefully laid the young girl on a bed in the orphanage's small infirmary and covered her with a blanket. Her eyes were focused on a single goal: to understand what was happening there. Why? Ever since Mariana's case had unfolded, the atmosphere in the orphanage had become so heavy, so strange. She walked to the library where the orphanage's records were kept. With trembling hands, she began rifling through files. Over the hours, her mind seemed to drift among reports of children's disappearances under mysterious circumstances. Some had been labeled accidents or escapes, but something in her told her those weren't sufficient explanation. The dates in the records began to align with the arrival of a new cycle of tension in the orphanage, always with children showing increasing strange behavior. Mrs. Anna, with a lump in her throat, knew she was touching something very old, something that the orphanage itself seemed to be. The silence of the walls, the presence of the shadows, and Clara's disjointed words were beginning to form a web of she could no longer ignore. Closed her eye, concentrated, trying to organize what or who was behind all of this. As she thought, the wind howled outside, and the shadow stretched across the walls of the library. The orphanage, that old building that had always been her home, now seemed like a sealed place, a prison with doors that closed without explanation. But there was no time left to fear. Clara was certain of something, and Mrs. Anna felt that the key to understanding what was happening was somewhere in there, inside that orphanage, hidden in the shadows. She couldn't wait any longer. Someone was waiting. And perhaps, if she could discover what had happened to Mariana, she could save Clara, and maybe all the other children. The truth was there, buried within the walls of that place, and Mrs. Anna was determined to unearth it, no matter what she would have to. When Mrs. Anna entered the orphanage's old archive, the smell of aged paper and dust filled her nostril. The shelves were crammed with folders, records, many of them faded with time. She moved along the shelves, anxiously searching for the oldest. Her fingers touched this carefully, as if she feared that any sudden movement might break the connection, the past, the one she needed to understand to resolve what was happening in the present. She opened a dusty folder, and as she flipped through the pages, she began to read the report. The first children mentioned seemed to have disappeared in a common manner, with no further explanation. But as she continued, something strange began. The dates were close together, and all the children had something in common. Before they vanished, they had talked about an invisible friend. Mrs. Anna stopped for a moment, her heart racing as she realized the repetition of the detail. The children, for the most part, had been newcomers to the orphanage, and before disappearing they had mentioned an invisible being, a presence that followed them, that watched them. And shortly after these conversations, the children simply vanished without a trace of warning. There were reports that, in some cases, the children appeared distant, as if they were removed from the world around them in a kind of trance. Others said their eyes were empty, as though they were staring at something no one else could see. The most disturbing thing, however, was the timeline. The children always disappeared shortly after talking about this invisible friend. Some records indicated that before disappearing, they were visibly disturbed, as though they were being drawn to something or someone that pulled them away. And in the last words they managed to say, they once again mentioned this friend, Mrs. Anna felt a deep shiver run down her spine as she read these details. Something was happening there, and the pattern was undeniable. She turned more pages, the words dancing in her mind, but a sense of dread began to settle in, something much darker happening in the orphanage than she could have ever imagined. The invisible friend seemed to be a common link, but what exactly was it? Why had so many children spoken about it before they disappeared? Mrs. Anna felt the muscles in her body tighten. She knew she had to learn more, but what she was reading gave her the sense that she was getting closer to something ancient and terrible, something the orphanage had been hiding for decades. A force, a presence that was not only supernatural, but perhaps something even deeper, more malevolent. She slammed the folder shut, her hands trembling. The silence in the archive was deafening, and the feeling of being watched, Clara had mentioned, seemed to intensify. The orphanage, that place which had always been her home, now appeared as a closed-off space where the secrets of the past were about to, and they wouldn't be. She knew she needed to talk to Clara, who might be the key to understanding what was happening. But as the fear grew in her chest, one persistent question lingered in her mind. Who or what was behind these disappearances? The answer was there, buried in the shadows of the orphanage, and she could no longer ignore the truth that was beginning to reveal itself. However, the archive did not provide clear answer. The names of the missing children were listed, no additional, as if someone had erased any information that was truly happening. Each file seemed carefully taken. Only a mention of a sudden death, followed by the constant reference to the invisible friend, the only common thread. Mrs. Anna rummaged through the file, searching for something that might explain the clue that would shed light on what was really going on there. Everything seemed hidden, as if someone, perhaps someone from within the orphanage itself, had made an effort to eliminate any trace explanation. The pages were almost empty, few dated records, and the feeling that the story was being deliberately manipulated made her feel powerless. But when she turned one last yellowed page, stopped. In the bottom corner of a sheet, almost imperceptible, a handwritten note scrawled in a different ink. The handwriting was hurried, written under pressure, or perhaps in a moment of panic. The message was short, but enough to tighten Mrs. Anna's throat. Don't look at the shadows, they know. Those words, so simple yet laden. made Mrs. Anna's blood run cold. Who could have written that, and what did it mean? She felt a wave of cold run down. She thought about the orphanage's windows. All was so dark even during the day, as if something was waiting to emerge from, as if something was hiding in plain but somehow invisible. Mrs. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process what she had. The fear that had previously only been creeping now became palpable, and she knew she was on the verge of something much larger, something the orphanage had apparently tried to cover up all this time. That simple sentence seemed to be the key to the mystery, but what did it really mean? Stood there alone in the dark and silent archive, while the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch, as if watching every movement. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. She couldn't ignore what had just discovered, but she knew she was approaching a point of no return. The truth about what was happening in the orphanage was not just in the records or the files. It was in the walls, in the shadows, and in the children who disappeared one by one. And now, more than ever, Mrs. Anna knew that the only way to stop it was to face what was in the shadows, something that hid in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. The orphanage, which she had always considered a safe home, now seemed to be the prison of an ancient evil that had long been waiting to be freed, and she would be forced to discover how far it would go, and what else was being hidden in the shadows. On the basement wall, Mrs. Anna noticed something that made her stop abruptly. A symbol, etched irregularly as if someone had tried to hide it, caught her attention. The mark was old, twisted, and deep lines, as if it had been made with something sharp, leaving a trace of blood from a forgotten time. The energy that emanated from those lines was palpable, cold, as if the very air around her had become denser and heavier. She approached cautious, her breath slowing, but also growing heavier, as if the environment around her was reacting to her presence. The symbol seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, a hidden force that spread across the walls of the base, impregnating every corner of the stifling, shadowy cold that gripped her body. Was deep, not just physical, but something more, a visceral sensation that made her feel as if time there was bending in the wrong way, as if the basement itself were an intersection between the real and the unknown. Mrs. Anna swallowed hard, her heart racing. It was impossible to ignore the impression that this was connected to everything happening at the orphanage. The link between the symbol and the disappearance of the children seemed undeniable. What did that drawing mean? Why would someone have tried to hide it? She felt as though the answers were there, buried, waiting to be discovered. With tremendous effort, she reached out and touched the wall where the symbol was carved, her hand trembling, but forcing herself not to pull back. As soon as her fingers made contact with the scratched lines, a surge of energy coursed through her body, almost making her recoil. The cold intensified, and for a moment, Mrs. Anna had the sensation that something inside that basement, something much older and more malevolent, was watching her with invisible eyes. It was as though the basement itself were alive, breathing, waiting for her to make the next move. She quickly withdrew her hand, gasping for breath, and took a step back, but she couldn't help but stare at the symbol once again. There was something there, something that couldn't be seen, but that she felt with overwhelming intensity, something that shouldn't be touched, but that she needed to understand. The memories of all the children who had disappeared flashed through her mind like a series of distorted images. Clara's words, Mariana's gaze, the silence that had settled in the orphanage, and now the symbol, as if it were the key to it all. She knew that the drawing wasn't just any symbol. It was a mark, a sign of something lurking, waiting for the right moment to fully manifest, something that fed on fear, darkness, and the innocence of children. Mrs. Anna closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself, but the weight of the discovery enveloped her as if the very air was being drained of its energy. She knew she had to keep going. She couldn't give up. Whatever was happening at the orphanage, she needed to understand it. She needed to know what that symbol meant, and how it was connected to the events that had been unfolding. And most importantly, she needed to discover who or what was behind it, because at that moment, Mrs. Anna knew that without answers, nothing, not even herself, would be said. That night, as the storm raged outside, the screams began. At first they were low, almost a whisper, but carried a deep pain, as if someone were fighting against an invisible suffering. Mrs. Anna felt panic take over her chest when the first screams echoed through the orphanage's hallway. The wind battered the windows. The sound of the screams seemed to surpass the noise of the storm, coming from somewhere inside those old, dark walls. She rose from her chair, her hands sweaty, and ran to the dormitories, her heart racing, fearing what she might. As the corridor screams grew louder, but they were never clear enough to reveal their origin. They were like muffled voices, trapped somewhere between the real world and the nightmare. Mrs. Anna felt a sense of oppression, as if the very air had thickened, making it harder to... When she reached the dormitories, the scene she found was even more terrifying than she had imagined. Some of the children were awake, their eyes wide and filled with dread. They huddled together in corners, muttering incomprehensible words, trying to protect themselves from something no one else could see. Others were in a deep sleep, but their contorted expression, the cold sweat, their foreheads, showed that they were not at peace. They were being tormented, their minds trapped in some kind of collective nightmare. Mrs. Anna ran to the first crib where one of the girls, small and fragile, was crying silently, her tears mixing sweat on her. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond her, as if she were staring at an invisible presence watching her. Mrs. Anna picked her up in her arms, trying to calm her, but the girl seemed incapable of finding comfort. "Dear, there's nothing here. You're safe." Trying to offer a sense of peace, the child did respond, her eyes still glazed, terrified. The crying of the other children grew louder, as if fear was spreading throughout the orphanage, trapping them in a state of panic. It was then that Mrs. Anna heard the screams again, now more intense, closer, but they were different. They were no longer whispered, were desperate screams, full of pain, as if someone were calling for help, someone trapped between the world of the living and the dead. She ran back down the hallway, trying to locate the source of those screams, but there was no one. Only the sound, coming from all directions, seemed to fill the orphanage, a collective cry of suffering. She looked at the windows but couldn't see anything beyond the curtains swaying in the wind, the rain hammering down. But something was happening, something that Mrs. Anna couldn't ignore. The children were being consumed by a nightmare, and she knew this was not just a simple disturbance. There was something much deeper, more sinister, unfolding in the orphanage. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus. She knew she needed to act quickly. What could she do? What was happening to them? And why did this evil seem to have taken hold of the orphanage when the storm seemed to have brought with it something dark? She needed. The truth was there, among the screams and the fear, and she couldn't allow that evil energy to take over the place she had always. She needed to do something before. Clara woke up in the middle of the night, her body drenched in cold. The silence that enveloped the orphanage was deep, but there was something else, something heavy in the air, as if an invisible presence was there, watching every movement, waiting for the right moment. Deep breath, trying to calm the panic that began to spread through her chest, but the feeling of being watched was too intense to ignore. Clara's eyes widened, and she fixed her gaze on the darkness of the room. What had once seemed like a safe refuge had now turned into a place of imminent threat. Something was wrong. She got out of bed, her cold feet touching the cold floor. But before she could move further, she heard a distant sound, a rustling, as if someone or something was moving down the hallway, dragging its feet slowly. Clara cautiously approached the door, her trembling fingers trying to reach for it. She opened it carefully, and that's when she saw in the hallway shadowy, indistinct figures moved as though they were dancing in the shadow. Vague shapes, almost imperceptible, but their presence was unmistakable. They were there in ever-increasing numbers, dark and silent, with an aura of terror that made Clara's skin crawl. She tried to scream, but her voice failed her, swallowed by the fear that gripped her. Her feet were stuck to the ground, as if some invisible force was paralyzing her, preventing her from moving, from fleeing. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to get out of there, but the terror was so great that her body refused to obey. The figures moved slowly, their presence dense and oppressive, filling the hallway with a sense of emptiness, of impending death. Clara tried to look away, but her eyes were fixed on the shadows that seemed to be drawing closer. It was as if they were pulling her in, as if they wanted to swallow her soul, taking her to a place. Time didn't exist, and the darkness, she felt a deep chill run down her, and the pressure in the air became unbearable, almost as if she were being crushed by an invisible, but tangible force. However, something still kept her from moving. It was as if an invisible barrier surrounded her, holding her in place. Clara tried to fight against the panic, to move, but her muscles wouldn't respond. The eyes of the shadows were on her now, as if the beings were watching her soul, waiting for the right moment to consume her. She was completely at their mercy, not knowing what to do or how to escape. That's when a low, almost inaudible sound made her stop. A whisper coming from somewhere in the shadows. "You can't escape." It was someone's voice, but not someone Clara knew. It was a cold, empty voice, devoid of life. And when the words dissolved into the air, the figures began to move even closer, as if they were about to cross the invisible barrier that kept her from moving. Clara, her eyes filled with terror, closed them hoping that it was all a nightmare. When she opened them again, the figures had disappeared, leaving behind only the emptiness and the deafening silence. But the fear still dominated. She knew that this wasn't a dream. The shadows were there. They were watching her, and she didn't know how long she could escape them. The orphanage would never be the same again. It was then that Clara remembered the story the older children used to tell, always with a tone of mystery, fear. They spoke in whispered, wide-eyed, and a distance as if to push away the very. They said that in the past, the orphanage was not just shelter, but a dark spot immersed in ancient secret. A place where the echoes of the past never fully faded. The stories spoke of obscure rituals performed by people who held unknown power, capable of invoking the souls of children who died under mysterious circumstances. According to the legend, those souls could not find rest as they were trapped in that place, waiting for something or someone, waiting for a greater force to either free them or condemn them to eternity of suffering and loneliness. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered those words. Throughout the time she had lived in the orphanage, she had always had a strange feeling that the walls were charged with something invisible, yet tangible, something that watched, that whispered in the shadows. But now, with the experience of that night, with the presence of the shadowy figures and the screams that dragged through the early mornings, she began to understand that perhaps those stories were not just. Maybe there was some truth in them, something she had not wanted to believe until now. She also remembered how the older children talked about the invisible friend that accompanied some of the younger ones. They always said that before disappearing, the children spoke of a being that watched, called them. The feeling of being watched, which Clara had experienced so many times, now felt more intense, as if that presence was drawing closer in a more threatening manner. But what were those shadowy figures? What did they want from them? The orphanage, which until then had seemed like a simple shelter for the children, now revealed itself as a place marked by something much deeper and more terrifying. The evil there was not just a matter of illness or tragedy. It was something ancient, rooted in the very foundations of building itself, something that fed off the pain and fear of the children, using them as pieces in a dark and merciless game. Clara closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but the images of the shadows and the screams persisted in her mind, as if everything were intertwining with the very history of the orphanage. She knew that something had to be done. The truth, the answer to all that suffering, was buried in the stories of the past, and she needed to find a way to face it before it was. She got up, still trembling, and made her way down the dark hallway, with the echoes of voices and shadowy figures following her every step. The feeling of being watched stronger. She knew something was waiting for her in the shadows. And now, more than ever, Clara understood that the orphanage was much more than a simple shelter. It was a prison, and the souls trapped there were not willing to rest. She would have to face what it took. For deep down, Clara knew that the fate of the children, including her own, depended on unraveling the secrets buried within the walls of the orphanage before the shadows took her completely. For days, Clara and Mrs. Anna searched for answers, scouring every corner of the orphanage, examining old records, questioning the few remaining staff, and trying to piece together the fragments of stories the children whispered. But the deeper they delved into the investigation, the more the orphanage seemed to close in on them, as if it had a life of its own, a silent presence that watched them with every step. The walls, which once seemed merely solitary and decaying, now exuded an oppressive mystery, as if they were hiding something that should never be revealed. With each new clue discovered, a new threat emerged. Mrs. Anna found more symbols carved in isolated areas of the building, marks hidden beneath layers of old paint, almost imperceptible. The records of the missing children became even more disturbing. In addition to the invisible friend, a repeated word began to appear more frequently. Passage. No clear explanation, but the children, shortly before they disappeared, spoke of a secret passage, a portal that would lead them to another place. But where? To where? Clara, in turn, felt as though she was being watched at every moment, as if the orphanage itself knew about her search. She saw figures in the shadows, heard whispers in the wind that moved the curtains, and felt a deep chill every time she passed near the windows, as if something were trying to crawl inside the building. The feeling of being watched never left her, and it only heightened her fear, making her feel that the orphanage was reacting. The children, who were already restless, seemed even more disturbed. Their eyes were empty, as though they were living in a state of altered consciousness, a distorted reality between the world of the living and the dead. They spoke to themselves in incomprehensible whispers, often staring into the void, as if conversing with something that no one else could see. Clara and Mrs. Anna began to realize that the children were the link, the intersection between the two worlds, the living and the dead. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the thunder roared loudly, the children began to exhibit some, especially the younger one, started calling out names that didn't belong to their families, while others seemed to invisible presences conversed with as if engaging in a dialogue with entity beyond. The sense that the orphanage fed off these lost children grew stronger each day. The more Clara and Mrs. Anna tried to uncover the truth, the more the orphanage seemed to rise up against them. The doors that had once been open now closed without explanation. The lamps went out, leaving the corridors immersed in darkness. The children's screams, once muffled, now seemed clearer, closer, as if something were trying to communicate with them through the walls, through the air. It seemed to be growing stronger, more impatient. With each new clue, a new layer of the nightmare unfolded. The orphanage was not merely a place of abandonment and pain. It was a convergence between two realities. The children, with their restless and trapped souls, were the keys, the bearers of the secret that the building had kept for so long. But there was something more, something darker that lurked in the depths of the orphanage. Something that now Clara and Mrs. Anna were beginning to understand. The true evil was rooted in the very foundation, and it would not let. The orphanage's clock seemed to have stopped. Time dragged on, but it did not move forward, as if the place itself of suffering. And as Mrs. Anna and Clara delved deeper into their search, one question remained: how far were they willing to uncover the secret? And more importantly, what would have discovered? One night, Clara finally faced feared for so long. The terror that had been chasing her, the unbearable weight that had taken hold of her chest every step she took, now drove her toward a single destination: the basement, the place where it all began, where the evil seemed to have taken root, the darkness taking over every corner of the orphanage. She knew there was no escaping it now. It was time to confront what hid in the depths of the building, what wanted to feed on the children's fear, what had taken Mariana. The air grew thicker as Clara descended the creaking stairs. The smell of mold, damp earth was suffocating, as though the very basement was alive, breathing along with her. When she reached the bottom, a deep silence enveloped. There was nothing except the dimness stretched across the space. But Clara knew something was there, lurking, waiting for her. And then she saw it. Mariana was in the darkest corner of the basement, standing still, motionless. Her hair was messy, her body so pale it seemed to absorb the light from the small lantern Clara carried. Her eyes were empty, devoid of light, as though something had extinguished her essence, as if the girl was no longer the same. Mariana's gaze did not meet Clara's. It seemed to look beyond, into a deep and distant void. Clara approached, fear overtaking her body, but she could not turn back. Mariana, her friend for so many years, was there, but somehow she was no longer Mariana. Something had transformed her. And then, what terrified Clara the most was the smile. A smile that stretched across her pale face, but held no joy, no life. It was an empty, distant smile, as if the girl were being controlled by a force that was not hers. "Mariana," Clara whispered, her voice trembling, filled with dread, but also with deep pain. She wanted to wake her, to bring the girl back to reality, but deep down, she knew something had happened, something that could not be easily undone. Mariana didn't seem to hear her. The smile remained on her face, an expression disconnected from reality, as though the girl's soul were trapped somewhere far away, unable to reach the world still present around her. The atmosphere around them seemed to weigh even heavier. The basement, with its damp, cracked walls, seemed to breathe along with that smile, as if the malignant presence was there, watching everything, controlling every movement. Clara tried to take another step closer, but fear paralyzed her. She felt an invisible force pushing her back, as though the very basement itself were rejecting her presence. "You are not alone," almost in a whisper, her eyes fixed on Mariana, hoping the girl could hear her. "I will get you out of here. I won't leave you alone." But Mariana's smile widened even more, an inhuman, cold and empty and then, to Clara's horror, the girl began to slowly shake her head, as if denying any attempt to rescue. Mariana's gaze, which had been fixed on the void, now turned toward Clara, and for a brief moment Clara felt as though that gaze pierced through her, as if she were being watched by something beyond the girl, something using Mariana's body to communicate. It was then that Clara understood. Mariana was no longer there. She was just being used, an empty shell. A lost soul, enslaved by something that fed on children, something that controlled their minds and souls. The basement seemed to close in even tighter on Clara. She took a step back, fear now choking her throat, but something inside her, a strength she didn't know she possessed, made her keep going. She knew she couldn't leave Mariana there, that she couldn't let the evil take another life, another innocent soul. Clara knew that Mariana's smile was the final warning, the sign that the true horror was still to come. She turned and ran toward the stairs, the sound of her own footsteps echoing like a drum in the deep silence of the basement. And as she hurried up, Clara heard a whisper, a low whisper, like a call, coming from the shadows that made her shiver. "You can't escape. They are here," Mariana said, with a voice that didn't seem like hers. The words came out cold, distant, as if some strange force had taken hold of her throat, turning her tone into something Clara didn't recognize. It wasn't the soft, innocent her friend, but an empty voice filled with deep, unsettling "They won't leave us in peace. We're trapped." Clara felt a chill run down her spine when she heard those. A shiver overtook and seemed to intensify, as if the air itself became thicker. Something was wrong, very wrong. She moved closer to Mariana, her heart pounding, wanting to understand what was happening, wanting to bring the girl back, but Mariana's words left her paralyzed. "We're trapped." What did she... Trapped by what? By whom? "Mariana, what are you saying?" Clara whispered, her voice breaking, but at the same time, she knew it wasn't a simple... There was something in those words, something that made her feel as if Mariana was trying to warn her about something much larger, much darker than she could comprehend. It was then that the girl lifted her up, now even empty, as if her soul was distant, out of her body, looking. A strange glow began to emanate from her eye, a light that seemed to pulse from within her mind, as if she were being consumed by something beyond this world. Whatever was taking over Mariana seemed to be taking over Clara as well, invading her being and making her feel an unbearable weight, as if she herself were about to be lost. Clara reached out her hand, desperate to touch her, to try to save Mariana, but before she could reach the girl, something incomprehensible, a blinding light exploded around Mariana, so intense and fast that Clara barely had time to The girl disappeared before her eyes, as if she had never existed, leaving only an emptiness in the space where she had been. The air around Clara seemed to distort, the sound muffled, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Clara stood there, paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the spot where Mariana had been just moments before. The emptiness surrounding her was oppressive, as if everything she had known was crumbling around her. Panic took over her. She felt a desperate need to understand what Mariana's words still echoed. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the very walls of the orphanage closing in. Clara no longer knew what was real. Everything was becoming a blur, an endless night. She felt a presence behind her, something dark, moving in the shadows. But what truly terrified her wasn't the sight of Mariana disappearing, the thought be telling that were they all, in some way, trapped? Trapped in the orphanage, trapped in that cursed place where time didn't flow and the shadows ruled. Clara didn't know what to do anymore, or how to escape. Reality was distorting, and now, alone, she felt that something even darker was waiting for her in the depths of the silence. Once comforting, now seemed deafening. She knew she couldn't stay there, that she needed to uncover what was really happening in the orphanage. But what would she do if she couldn't escape before it was too late? Clara was found days later, wandering the orphanage halls, her steps slow and hesitant, as if she were lost in a labyrinth she couldn't understand. Her eyes were glazed, unfocused, as if she were in another place, another reality, disconnected from everything around her. Her hair, once neat, was tangled and dirty, and her clothes, now worn and covered in dust, seemed like they had been abandoned for weeks. What Mrs. Anna found was not the Clara she knew. The young girl was disoriented, completely beside herself. When Mrs. Anna called her, her voice trembling with worry, Clara slowly turned around, her eyes fixed on her, but empty. There was no recognition, only a distant, as if Clara were trapped in a nightmare that no one else could comprehend. "Clara, my dear, what happened?" Mrs. Anna asked softly, trying to reach the young girl's gaze. But Clara only murmured disconnected words, without logic, as if the words were fragments of broken thoughts that she couldn't piece together. "I saw they were in the hallway. They were watching me," Clara mumbled, but her words were mixed with incomprehensible sound. Mrs. Anna felt a knot tighten in her throat. The young girl was there, but not there. She seemed lost in something that couldn't be seen, as if something much deeper was happening in her mind. Mrs. Anna tried once again to calm Clara, holding her hands gently, but Clara was too far gone. She didn't recognize Mrs. Anna, didn't respond to her question. Her lips moved, but the words didn't make sense. She talked about shadows, voices calling to a door she had seen, but nothing was clear. It was as if the young girl were speaking in a strange language, a code that only she could understand. "The basement. Mariana, I can't leave," Clara murmured, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Every word that left her lips seemed to be a piece of a story she couldn't finish, as if she were trying to remember something that had already been lost forever. Mrs. Anna, with a heavy heart and teary eyes, knew that something terrible had happened. Clara was no longer the same, and the words coming from her mouth only confirmed what she feared. The evil that had taken over the orphanage was not just something physical, something that could be fixed or expelled. It was something that affected the mind, the soul, leaving its victims trapped in a state of confusion and despair, unable to free themselves. Mrs. Anna tried to get Clara to lie down on the bed, but the young girl curled up, her body tense, as if waiting for something or someone. Clara's words continued to flow in a strange sequence, a series of images that Mrs. Anna couldn't fully understand. But deep in her heart, she knew that something much darker was happening. For days, Clara stayed there, in the small room that had once been her refuge. Mrs. Anna, along with the few staff members left at the orphanage, tried to calm her, but nothing seemed to work. The young girl seemed to be in a state between sleep and wakefulness, as if her mind had been torn from her body, wandering in a reality that was no longer hers. And in the meantime, the atmosphere of the orphanage grew heavier with each passing day. The children, once somewhat restless, were now quieter, darker. The orphanage, which had already seemed full of secrets, now exuded an oppressive tension. Something was about to happen, and no one knew exactly, but Mrs. Anna felt in every fiber of her being that Clara had become a warning, a reflection of what was to come. Clara's disconnected words were only the beginning, and like a shadow that never fades, the evil that had taken over the orphanage was now spreading, touching everyone who lived there. And the worst part, perhaps, was that no one knew how to stop it. Since then, the orphanage was abandoned. Its once imposing and welcoming walls were now covered in moss and cracks, as if time itself had given up trying to fix it. The broken windows let out only shadow, and the rusted, crooked iron gate stood slightly ajar, like a silent invitation who dared as the orphanage swallowed by the trees growing unchecked, embracing the decay, but within its ruins something that no one fully understands. To this day, those who pass by the old orphanage, especially during stormy nights, swear they hear the soft, anguished whispers of the children. These are low murmurs, almost imperceptible, but filled with immense suffering, words that seem to beg for release, but never reach those who hear them. Those who listen say the voices come from inside the building, the walls and the foundation, as if the souls of the children were trapped there, waiting for something that would never come. The winds, which still howl on stormy nights, carry with them a secret, something that will never be revealed. They are like ancient laments, echoes of a past that could not be erased, a pain that refuses to fade. Those who dare to approach the ruins say that on some nights the air is dense and cold, as if the orphanage itself were still alive, breathing and waiting. What happened there? What was left? No one knows. But the stories about the place, told in whispers, speak of an ancient evil, an evil that cannot be exorcised. Perhaps within those broken and crumbling walls lies the answer, a mystery that will never be solved, a secret that the children, now trapped in the limbo between the world of the living and the dead, will carry with them forever. And so the orphanage remains, lonely and forgotten, but not it. For what happens within its walls cannot be erased, and as long as the wind howls on stormy nights, the whispers of the children will continue to echo, pleading to be freed, never heard. The town's residents speak of the old orphanage with trepidation, as if the mere name is enough to bring back the darkest memory and deepest fears. No one dares approach the ruins, and over the years, fear has become an invisible cloak that covers the region, driving away even the bravest. The legends of the orphanage grow with each passing day, like a shadow that spreads and takes over the town. With every generation, the details of the stories change, but the essence remains the same, a cursed place where the souls of the lost children still wander, waiting for a new victim. They say that on some nights, when the wind blows fiercely, clouds cover the sky, it's possible to see a shadow moving through the orphanage's broken windows, a silent figure that seems to float among the rubble. What is even more terrifying, however, is the smile, an empty, distorted, lifeless smile that appears suddenly and vanishes just as quickly. It is the last trace of what once was human, now consumed by something much darker. Those brave enough to observe from a distance swear that this smile is always awaiting the next lost soul, someone unsuspecting enough to come close to. Children playing in the streets near the ruins talk about a presence when they approach the orphanage. They say that sometimes the entire town seems to grow quieter as night falls, as if the air itself becomes heavier, denser. Some adults tried to dismiss the stories, claiming they are merely superstitions, but most know that somewhere within the debris of that building, there's something that cannot be explained. When stormy nights arrive, the wind howling through the trees seems to carry the whispers of the past, and those who dare walk those desolate streets say that amidst the storm, it's possible to hear the sound of footsteps echoing in the silence, as if someone is waiting in the shadows. But when they turn around, there is no one, only the emptiness of the orphanage with its broken windows and rusted doors, still staring at the town as if waiting for something or someone. The stories, though unconfirmed, are enough to keep the town at a distance. The orphanage remains like a black stain on the horizon, a reminder of the evil that once inhabited it and the souls that still haven't found peace. And as the legends continue to grow, the shadowy figure and the empty smile become more and more of a truth for the resident, a constant presence that patiently waiting its lost soul. The orphanage remains there in its dark solitude, like an eternal prison, its walls corroded by time and pain, yet still imposing, challenging anyone who dares approach. The wind passing through its broken windows whispers forgotten stories, echoes of a time of suffering and despair that never ceased. Each dawn, the place seems more dead, but as night falls, it awakens from its apathy, absorbing the darkness and sadness that surround it. Those who dare enter, they will never leave unscathed. The orphanage's doors do not close by chance, and the corridors that were once filled with laughter and play now stretch like impenetrable labyrinth, where footsteps echo with a sound that doesn't seem human. Those who have ventured to explore its depth speak of a weight in the air, something invisible but tangible, suffocating and confusing them. The walls, they say, have eyes, and the shadows stretch further each night are not mere reflections of the absence of light. They are the big ghosts, constantly moving, waiting The shadows of the past never. The laments of the lost children who in life never knew peace remain in the depths of the orphan. The echoes of their screams, of their whisper reverberate within the wall as if there is still an extension of their soul. Anyone who walks there feels a weight on their chest, a presence that watches, waits, ready to pull in the most innocent or the most unprepared. Because the evil that resides there is not a common evil, it is not something that can be exorcised or driven away. It is immersed in the very foundation, the orphanage, as rooted as the foundation themselves. Time seems to stand still in that. Every corner, every crack in the walls holds a secret, an untold story, an unbroken curse. The orphanage continues to stand there, like a sleeping monster, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal itself completely, to consume everything and everyone who comes too close, does not forgive. And as the shadows stretch, those who dare to look at its ruins feel that sooner or later the orphanage will claim what is its own, an eternal prison where pain never fades and where the darkness never ceases to wait.